I learned to read Latin before I learned to curtsy. And that single truth would one day save a duke's life and destroy everything I thought I knew about my own. But on that autumn evening, as I poured wine into crystal glasses and kept my eyes lowered like a proper servant, I had no notion that the words of a dead language would become the bridge between silence and salvation. My name is Cecilia Thornwood, and I was not born to serve. My father, Edmund Thornwood, had been a scholar of modest means but extraordinary mind, a man who translated ancient texts for universities and noble patrons who never remembered his name. Our cottage near Cambridge was small and draughty, filled with more books than furniture, and I grew up believing that knowledge was the greatest inheritance a father could leave his daughter. He taught me Latin and Greek before I turned 10, let me sit beside him as he worked through Cicero and Seneca, and told me that a woman's mind was no less capable than a man's, only less permitted. I believed him. I still do. But tuberculosis does not care for belief, and poverty even less so. My father died when I was 17, coughing blood onto the pages of an unfinished translation. And within 6 months, I had sold every book we owned and still could not pay our debts. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with watching your father's life's work carried away in crates by men who cannot read a single word of it. I carried that grief with me into service, folded it small and tucked it beneath my apron, where it pressed against my heart with every step I took through halls I would never own. By the time I arrived at Ravens Hollow, I had already served in 2 lesser households and learned the essential art of invisibility. A good servant is not seen. A good servant does not speak unless spoken to. A good servant certainly does not understand the private conversations of her betters, conducted in French at dinner parties or Latin in the library when secrets must be kept from common ears. I had mastered the blank expression, the downcast gaze, the posture of perpetual deference. No one looked at me twice. No one suspected that behind my plain face and calloused hands lived a mind that could parse Virgil in the original, and had once dreamed of attending lectures at universities that would never admit her. Ravens Hollow was the grandest house I had ever entered. It rose from the Northumberland moors like a dark cathedral, all grey stone and Gothic windows, turrets disappearing into the fog that rolled in from the sea. The estate had belonged to the Blackwood family for 300 years, and every corridor whispered with the weight of that history. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following me as I scrubbed floors and carried linens. The house had 114 rooms, though half of them stood empty and sheeted, closed off since the death of the Duchess 3 years prior. The Duke of Ravenshollow, Lord Sebastian Blackwood, was 34 years old and had not smiled since his wife was buried in the family chapel. That was what the other servants told me in hushed voices during our brief evening meals in the kitchen. They spoke of him the way villagers speak of a haunted ruin, with fear and fascination in equal measure. He was tall, they said, with dark hair silvered early at the temples and eyes the color of a winter storm. He rarely left his study. He took his meals alone. He had dismissed his wife's lady's maid the day after the funeral and ordered her chambers sealed, the door locked, the key thrown into the sea. I did not see him for my first 3 weeks at Ravenshollow. I was assigned to the lower floors, to the kitchens and scullery, where my Latin was useless and my small hands were valued only for their ability to scrub pots without complaint. But I listened, as I always did, and I learned. I learned that the Duke had once been different. Before his marriage, he had been known in London society as a man of charm and intellect, a patron of the arts, a rider of enviable skill. He had courted Lady Margaret Ashford for 2 seasons before she accepted him, and their wedding had been the event of the year. They had been happy, the older servants said, genuinely, radiantly happy. And then she had died in childbirth, along with the son who never drew breath, and Sebastian Blackwood had become a ghost haunting his own house. There were other whispers too, darker ones. The Duke's father had been a confidant of the old king, deeply involved in matters of court and crown. When the new king ascended to the throne, alliances shifted like sand, and the late duke had found himself on the wrong side of a political tide he could not turn. He died under mysterious circumstances, officially a hunting accident, unofficially something far more sinister. And now the son was watched, suspected, surrounded by spies who posed as servants and guests who reported every word back to the palace. The Duke of Ravenshollow was loyal, some said. The Duke of Ravenshollow was a traitor, others countered. No one knew the truth except perhaps the Duke himself, and he spoke to no one. I might have spent my entire tenure at Ravenshollow without ever exchanging a word with him, if not for an accident of fate on a Thursday afternoon in late October. One of the upstairs maids had fallen ill with fever, and Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper, needed someone to deliver fresh candles to the west wing. She looked at me with narrowed eyes, assessing my plainness, my quietness, my apparent lack of curiosity, and decided I could be trusted not to disturb His Grace. I took the candles and climbed the stairs with my heart beating louder than my footsteps. The west wing was silent as a tomb. Dust motes floated in the pale light that filtered through windows no one had cleaned in months. I moved carefully, counting doors, until I reached the study where I had been instructed to leave my delivery. The door was slightly ajar. I should have knocked. I should have announced myself. Instead, I heard a voice and froze. He was reading aloud. Latin. Seneca's Letters, if I was not mistaken, the passage about the shortness of life and the waste of grief. His voice was low and rough, as though he had not used it in some time, and there was something in his pronunciation that made me ache. My father had read to me in that same halting, reverent way, treating each word as sacred. I must have made a sound, a breath, or a rustle of my skirts, because the reading stopped abruptly and the door swung open. And there he was, the Duke of Ravenshollow, exactly as the servants had described, and nothing like them at all. He was tall, yes, with dark hair and gray eyes, but what they had failed to mention was the way those eyes held pain, like a cup holds water, filled to the brim and trembling. He looked at me as though I were an apparition, some spirit come to disturb his solitude, and I realized I had forgotten how to speak. He asked me what I wanted. His voice was not unkind, merely tired, the voice of a man who had exhausted his capacity for emotion and now operated on habit alone. I lifted the candles in explanation, and something flickered across his face, perhaps amusement, perhaps irritation, before he stepped aside to let me enter. The study was a sanctuary of books. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, leather spines and gilt lettering, and the smell of paper and ink that transported me instantly to my father's cottage. I must have stared, because when I turned back to the Duke, he was watching me with an expression I could not decipher. He asked if I could read. Not mockingly, as some masters might, but with genuine curiosity, as though my answer actually mattered. I told him yes. He asked what languages, and before I could stop myself, before I could remember my place and my disguise, I said Latin and Greek and French and some German. The words hung in the air between us, a confession I had not meant to make. He did not laugh. He did not dismiss me. He simply nodded, slowly, and told me to return the next day at the same hour. Then he turned back to his desk, and I understood that I had been released. I returned the next day, and the day after that. The Duke would read aloud, sometimes asking my opinion on a translation or a philosophical point, and I would answer as best I could while maintaining the fiction that I was merely a servant with an unusual education. He never asked how I had learned. He never asked about my family or my past. He seemed to accept my presence the way one accepts the presence of a fire in winter, useful and warming and not requiring explanation. For my part, I told myself that I was simply grateful for the opportunity to exercise my mind again, to speak of something other than laundry and meal schedules. I told myself that the flutter in my chest when he looked at me was merely nervousness, The natural anxiety of a servant in the presence of her master. I was lying, of course, but I did not yet know it. The king's visit was announced in early November, arriving by royal messenger on a gray morning that smelled of coming snow. The household erupted into chaos. Rooms were unsealed and aired, silver polished, linens washed and pressed. Mrs. Brennan walked the halls with a face like a storm cloud, counting inventories and issuing orders with military precision. The Duke himself emerged from his study more frequently, meeting with his steward and his solicitor, his expression unreadable, but his movements tense. I understood, as the other servants did not, what this visit truly meant. The king was not coming to honor the Duke. He was coming to judge him, perhaps to accuse him, perhaps worse. The royal court was a serpent's nest of intrigue, and a visit from the monarch was as likely to end in a title stripped as in a favor granted. I watched the Duke's face during those weeks of preparation and saw fear beneath the composure. He knew what I knew. He was walking toward a trial he might not survive. The night of the royal arrival, I was assigned to serve in the Great Hall. I had been chosen, Mrs. Brennan informed me, because I was quiet and plain and unlikely to attract attention. I accepted the assignment with the same blank expression I had perfected over years of service, though inside I was trembling. I would be close to the king himself, close to the men who whispered in his ear, close to danger I could not name but could feel, pressing against my skin like the air before a thunderstorm. The great hall of Ravenshollow had been transformed. Hundreds of candles blazed in chandeliers and candelabras, casting dancing shadows on walls hung with tapestries depicting hunts and battles. A fire roared in the massive hearth, and the long table was set with the finest plate and crystal the house possessed. The Duke stood at the head of the hall, dressed in black velvet, his face a mask of courtesy as he welcomed his sovereign. The king was a small man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. He entered with an entourage of advisors and guards, each one carrying themselves with the arrogance of those who borrow power from greater men. They filled the hall with noise and movement, and I pressed myself against the wall, invisible, watching. Dinner proceeded with excruciating formality. I poured wine and removed plates and kept my gaze on the floor, but I listened. I always listened. The king spoke of trivial matters, hunting and horses and the tedium of country living. The Duke responded with appropriate deference. The advisors ate and drank and said nothing of consequence. It was theater, I realized. Elaborate, dangerous theater with the script yet to be revealed. It happened near the end of the meal. The king leaned toward one of his advisors, an older man with a face like a blade, and spoke in a low voice that nonetheless carried in the sudden lull of conversation. He spoke in Latin, smooth and fluent, clearly expecting no one else at the table to understand. Claudite portas, nemo exeat vivus, lock the doors, let no one leave alive. My blood turned to ice. I stood frozen with a wine decanter in my hands, staring at nothing, my mind racing. The other servants continued their work, oblivious. The nobles at the table chatted on, unaware. Only I had understood. Only I knew that the king had just ordered the death of every person in this room, beginning, I was certain, with the Duke. I looked at Sebastian Blackwood, at the man who had shared Seneca with me, and never asked why I could understand, and I made a choice. Later, I would wonder what madness possessed me. Later, I would question whether I had acted out of loyalty or love, or simply the wild impulse of a scholar's daughter who had read too many stories of heroism and sacrifice. But in that moment, there was no thought at all. There was only movement. I dropped the decanter. It shattered on the stone floor with a crash that silenced the room, and in the chaos of servants rushing to clean the mess, I slipped toward the Duke's chair. I leaned close, as though apologizing for my clumsiness, and whispered the only words that mattered. They mean to kill you tonight. The king ordered it in Latin. You must leave. Now. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw first confusion, then understanding, then something that might have been gratitude. He gave no outward sign of alarm. He simply rose from his chair, announced that he felt unwell, and begged His Majesty's forgiveness for retiring early. The king's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but he waved his permission. The Duke walked out of the great hall with measured steps, and I watched him go, knowing that I had just committed treason against my sovereign. I did not know that he would be waiting for me in the servants' corridor, or that he would take my hand and pull me into the darkness of the passage I had not known existed behind the kitchen wall. I did not know that we would run through tunnels carved by his ancestors for just such emergencies, our breath echoing off damp stone, the sounds of shouting and slamming doors fading behind us. I did not know that by morning we would be miles from Raven's Hollow, hiding in a woodcutter's abandoned cottage, and that my life as a servant would be over forever. All I knew, as the darkness swallowed us and the Duke's hand gripped mine with desperate strength, was that I had saved him, and that whatever came next, I could not bring myself to regret it. The cottage smelled of rotting wood and old smoke, but to me it smelled like safety. We arrived as the first pale light of dawn crept through the trees, both of us soaked from crossing the river that marked the edge of the Raven's Hollow estate, both of us shivering with cold and the aftermath of terror. The Duke released my hand only when we were inside, the door barred behind us, and even then he stood at the single grimy window for a long moment, watching the tree line as though expecting the king's men to emerge from the shadows at any instant. I busied myself with practical matters because practical matters were the only thing keeping me from collapsing entirely. There was a fireplace, though the chimney was likely blocked with years of debris. There was a wooden cot in the corner, its mattress long since rotted away, leaving only the bare frame. There were mice droppings on the floor and cobwebs thick as curtains across every surface. It was miserable and cold and utterly inadequate, and I had never been more grateful for a roof over my head. The Duke spoke first. He asked my name, my real name, and I realized with a start that in all our afternoons of Latin and philosophy, he had never once asked what to call me. I had been the servant who read, the anomaly, the curiosity that entered his study and left again without requiring the basic courtesy of identity. I told him I was Cecilia Thornwood, daughter of Edmund Thornwood, and waited for recognition that did not come. My father's name meant nothing to a duke. My father's entire life's work meant nothing to a man born into wealth and title. The familiar bitterness rose in my throat, but I swallowed it. This was not the time. He told me I could call him Sebastian. Not your grace, not my lord, just Sebastian, as though we were equals rather than a duke and the servant who had thrown away everything to save him. I did not know what to do with that gift, so I simply nodded and turned my attention to finding something we could use to start a fire. We did not speak again for hours. The fire, once coaxed to life with dried leaves and the splintered remains of a broken chair, filled the cottage with warmth and smoke in equal measure. I found a tin pot beneath the debris and collected rainwater from the leak in the roof, boiling it to something approaching cleanliness. The Duke sat on the floor with his back against the wall, his fine black velvet covered in mud and his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked nothing like a duke. He looked like a man who had lost everything and was only beginning to comprehend the depth of his loss. I should have felt the same devastation. I had abandoned my position, my only source of income, my only protection from the workhouse or worse. I had committed treason against the King of England and would hang for it if caught. I had nothing now, no references, no savings, no family to shelter me. And yet, sitting across from Sebastian Blackwood in that ruined cottage, watching the firelight play across his exhausted features, I felt something I had not felt since my father died. I felt alive. I felt seen. I felt as though, for the first time in 5 years, I existed as more than a pair of useful hands and a blank, forgettable face. He asked me, eventually, how I knew Latin. His voice was hoarse from disuse and cold, but there was genuine curiosity in it, the same curiosity he had shown that first day in his study. I told him about my father, about the cottage near Cambridge and the books and the dreams that had died with a scholar who never achieved the recognition he deserved. I told him about selling the library, about entering service, about learning to hide my education behind silence and subservience. I told him more than I had told anyone in years, and he listened without interruption, his gray eyes fixed on my face as though I were reciting scripture. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that broke me open in ways I had not known I was closed. He said that my father would have been proud of me, not for saving a duke, not for understanding Latin when it mattered, but for surviving, for carrying his legacy inside me through years of hardship that would have crushed a lesser spirit. He said that Edmund Thornwood's daughter was clearly as remarkable as Edmund Thornwood himself, and that he was honored to have been saved by her. I wept. I had not wept since my father's funeral, had not allowed myself the luxury of tears when there was work to be done and survival to secure. But in that moment, in that ruined cottage, with the fire crackling and the rain beginning to fall outside, I wept as though something had finally cracked inside me that had needed to crack for years. And Sebastian Blackwood, the cold and grieving Duke of Ravenshollow, crossed the small space between us and sat beside me and let me cry against his shoulder until I had no tears left. We stayed in the cottage for 3 days. The rain continued without mercy, turning the forest floor to mud and making travel impossible. Sebastian told me that his family had prepared for emergencies like this for generations, that there were safe houses and hidden caches throughout the countryside, established during times of political upheaval when noble families could fall from favor overnight. This cottage was the first refuge on a route that would eventually lead us to a ship on the northern coast, a ship that could take us to France or Holland or wherever the king's reach could not follow. I asked him if he intended to flee England forever. He did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was heavy with a grief that had nothing to do with the present danger. He told me about his wife, Margaret. He told me about how they had met at a ball when he was 26 and she was 19, how she had laughed at his attempts at poetry and challenged him to chess and beaten him soundly 3 games in a row. He told me about their wedding and their first year of marriage and the joy they had shared when she told him she was with child. And then he told me about the night she died, bleeding in their bed while he held her hand and begged God for a miracle that never came. He said that he had wanted to die with her, that for months afterward he had considered following her into death, had stood at the edge of the cliffs near Ravenshollow, and felt the wind pulling him toward the rocks below. He had stayed alive only because he could not bear the thought of leaving Ravenshollow undefended, of letting the king's men pick through his family's legacy without opposition. He had stayed alive out of duty and spite, not love of living. But now, he said, looking at me with an expression I could not name, now something had changed. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. I felt the same change stirring in my own chest, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. On the 4th morning, the rain stopped, and we continued our journey. Sebastian knew the paths well, had explored them as a boy with his father and brothers, and he led us through forests and across fields, avoiding roads where the king's men might be watching. We traveled mostly in silence, conserving our energy. But when we stopped to rest, we talked. We talked about philosophy and history and the nature of power. We talked about books we had loved and places we wished to see. We talked about small things and large things and everything in between, and with each conversation, I felt the distance between servant and master dissolving like morning mist. I learned that Sebastian had 2 younger brothers, both living abroad. Edward was a naval officer stationed in the Caribbean, and Thomas had taken holy orders and served in a monastery in Italy. Their mother had died when Sebastian was 12, and their father had raised them with stern affection and high expectations. Sebastian had been the dutiful heir, accepting the responsibilities of title and estate without complaint. while Edward had rebelled and Thomas had retreated into faith. They wrote letters occasionally, but the distances were vast and the correspondence infrequent. Sebastian spoke of his brothers with a wistfulness that told me he missed them more than he would ever admit. I told him about my own childhood, about the mother I had never known and the father who had been my entire world. I told him about the dreams I had harbored before reality crushed them, the foolish hope that somehow a woman of my station might find a way to study, to learn, to contribute something to the world beyond clean floors and pressed linens. He listened without condescension, without the dismissive smile that men usually wore when women spoke of intellectual ambition. He listened as though my dreams mattered, and in his listening, he gave them back to me. We reached the second safe house on the 5th day, a hunting lodge hidden in a valley so remote that Sebastian said even the local villagers had forgotten its existence. It was in far better condition than the cottage, with proper beds and stores of preserved food and a well that still produced clean water. We would stay here, Sebastian explained, until he could make contact with allies who might help us reach the coast. He had friends in the north, men who owed his father debts of loyalty that transcended political fashion. If they could be trusted, we might yet escape England alive. The waiting was the hardest part. Each day that passed increased the likelihood that the king's men were drawing closer, following our trail, asking questions in villages, offering rewards for information. I caught Sebastian standing at the window often, his jaw tight with tension, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man preparing for battle. I wanted to comfort him, but I did not know how. I was a servant, I reminded myself. I was nobody. Whatever had passed between us in the cottage, whatever understanding we had reached, could not erase the vast gulf of station and birth that separated us. And yet he looked at me sometimes as though that gulf did not exist. He looked at me as though I were the only solid thing in a world turned to quicksand, and I did not know what to do with the hope that look ignited in my heart. On the 8th night, everything changed. I had retired early, exhausted from a day spent cleaning and organizing the lodge, trying to make our refuge feel less like a prison. I was half asleep when I heard voices outside, rough and unfamiliar, and the sound of horses. My blood ran cold. I crept to the window and saw torchlight dancing through the trees, saw figures on horseback approaching the lodge with weapons drawn. I ran to Sebastian's room without thinking of propriety or protocol. He was already awake, already dressed, his face grim in the moonlight. He told me to take the back passage, a hidden door behind the fireplace that led to a tunnel and eventually to the river. He told me to run and not look back, to find his brother Edward in Jamaica and tell him what had happened. He pressed a letter into my hands, sealed with the Blackwood crest, and told me it would explain everything. I refused. The word came out of my mouth before I could stop it, fierce and certain and nothing like the obedient servant I had been trained to be. I told him I had not saved his life only to abandon him now. I told him that we would face this together or not at all. I told him that I was done running. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he did something I never expected. He laughed. It was a brief, startled sound, rusty from disuse, but it was unmistakably a laugh. He said that Edmund Thornwood's daughter was indeed remarkable, and that he would be a fool to argue with such determination. We did not run. We hid instead, in a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor that Sebastian's grandfather had dug for exactly such emergencies. We crouched in darkness, pressed together in a space barely large enough for two, and listened as the men above searched the lodge. They were not king's soldiers, I realized as I heard their voices. They were common thieves, bandits who had spotted the smoke from our fire and hoped to find easy prey. They ransacked the main rooms, took what food and valuables they could find, and eventually left, disappointed by the meager pickings. We stayed in the cellar until dawn, until we were certain they would not return. When Sebastian finally pushed open the trapdoor and helped me climb out, we stood in the destroyed remnants of our refuge and looked at each other. And something passed between us in that look, something that had been building since the great hall at Ravenshollow and could no longer be denied. He kissed me. Or I kissed him. Later, I could never remember who moved first. I only remembered the shock of it, the warmth of his mouth on mine, the way his hands trembled as they cupped my face. It lasted only a moment, a single breath of connection before we pulled apart. But in that moment, everything I had told myself about duty and station and impossibility crumbled to dust. He apologized. He said he had no right. He said I must think him a monster, taking advantage of a woman who had sacrificed everything for his sake. I told him to be quiet. I told him that I had wanted that kiss as much as he had, perhaps more. I told him that I did not know what we were to each other or what we could become, but that I was tired of pretending I felt nothing. We did not speak of it again for days. There was too much to do, too much danger pressing in from all sides. But something had shifted between us, a barrier fallen that could not be rebuilt. When we walked closer together. When we talked more honestly. When our hands brushed accidentally, we did not pull away. I was falling in love with him. I knew it was madness. I knew that even if we survived this flight, even if we reached safety and freedom, there could be no future for a duke and a servant girl. Society would never accept it. His family would never accept it. The law itself conspired against such unions, marking them as invalid, their children as illegitimate. I knew all of this, and still I fell. Because Sebastian Blackwood did not look at me and see a servant. He looked at me and saw Cecilia Thornwood, daughter of a scholar, keeper of languages, saver of dukes. He looked at me and saw someone worth seeing. And after 5 years of invisibility, that was a gift beyond measure. On the 12th day, a rider came. He was an old man, weathered by decades of hard living, and he wore the livery of no house, but carried a signet ring that Sebastian recognized at once. His name was Bartholomew Gray, and he had served Sebastian's father before Sebastian was born. He had received word of the Duke's flight through channels too secretive to explain and had come to offer aid. There was a ship, Bartholomew said. It would sail from Whitby Harbor in 5 days, bound for Amsterdam. The captain was loyal, the crew discreet. If we could reach the coast in time, we could leave England behind and start again in a land where the English king's wrath could not follow. Sebastian thanked him with a formality that could not disguise his emotion. He asked about Ravenshollow, about the servants, about what had happened after our escape. Bartholomew's face darkened. The king's men had ransacked the estate, he said. They had found nothing, because there was nothing to find, but they had arrested several servants for questioning. Mrs. Brennan was among them, accused of complicity in the Duke's treason. I thought of Mrs. Brennan, who had shown me no particular kindness, but no particular cruelty either, and felt guilt settle into my stomach like a stone. She was suffering because of me. They all were. I had saved one life and endangered many others, and I did not know if the scales balanced. Sebastian saw my face and understood. He took my hand, there in front of Bartholomew, with no care for propriety, and told me that I had done what was right. He told me that Mrs. Brennan and the others would be released when no evidence was found. He told me that I should not carry guilt for the king's tyranny. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the scales balanced, that my choice had been noble rather than selfish. But doubt is a persistent creature, and it followed me as we prepared for the final leg of our journey. It whispered that I had not saved Sebastian Blackwood out of abstract justice or servant's loyalty. I had saved him because I had already, without knowing it, begun to love him, and I did not know if love was enough to justify what I had done. The road to Whitby wound through moorland so desolate it seemed the edge of the world, and perhaps it was. I had never been so far north, never seen landscapes so raw and untouched by human ambition. And there were moments during that journey when I forgot we were fleeing for our lives and simply marveled at the savage beauty surrounding us. The heather had turned brown with autumn, spreading like a vast rusted sea beneath skies that shifted from pewter to violet to the deep gray of old bruises. Wind swept across the open land with nothing to stop it, carrying the salt smell of the distant sea and the promise of freedom or ruin. Bartholomew had provided horses, sturdy northern breeds accustomed to rough terrain, and we rode through the days with few stops, eating in the saddle, speaking only when necessary. Sebastian had transformed since Bartholomew's arrival. The exhausted fugitive who had sat beside me in the ruined cottage was gone, replaced by a man of purpose and determination. He rode ahead of me, scanning the horizon for threats, consulting maps with Bartholomew during our brief rests, making decisions with the confidence of someone born to command. I watched him become the Duke again, and I felt the distance between us growing with every mile. It was foolish to have expected anything different. The kiss in the hunting lodge had been a moment of weakness, born of fear and relief and the strange intimacy of survival. Now that help had arrived, now that escape was within reach, Sebastian Blackwood would remember who he was and who I was not. He would be grateful, certainly. He might even provide for me once we reached Amsterdam, find me a position in some merchant's household where my languages could be useful. But gratitude was not love, and provision was not partnership. I had been a servant long enough to know the difference. On the third night of our journey, we stopped at an inn. It was a risk, Bartholomew acknowledged, but the horses needed rest, and so did we. The inn was small and rough, catering to farmers and travelers of modest means, the sort of place where a duke would never set foot under normal circumstances. But Sebastian had shed his fine clothes days ago, wearing now the simple wool and leather of a country gentleman, and with the mud of the road obscuring his aristocratic bearing, he passed well enough for an ordinary man. Bartholomew secured 2 rooms, one for himself and Sebastian, one for me. The innkeeper barely glanced at us, more interested in our coin than our identities, and soon we were seated in the common room with bowls of thin stew and tankards of ale that tasted of smoke and copper. I ate without tasting, too tired to care about the quality of the food, and watched the other patrons with the wariness of prey among predators. None of them paid us any attention. We were invisible, just 3 more weary travelers seeking shelter from the wind. Sebastian excused himself early, claiming exhaustion, and retired to his room. I stayed in the common room longer, unable to face the solitude of my own small chamber with its narrow bed and drafty window. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I stared into its flames as though they might reveal some answer to the questions that plagued me. What would become of me in Amsterdam? What would become of us? Was there even an us to speak of, or had I invented that connection from loneliness and longing? A voice interrupted my reverie. One of the patrons, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, had approached my table. He asked if I was traveling alone, and when I said no, he nodded and asked no more. But he sat down across from me, uninvited, and began to speak of other things. He was a merchant, he said, trading wool between Yorkshire and the Scottish border. He had a wife and 3 daughters, all of them determined to marry above their station, and he indulged them because he remembered being young and full of impossible dreams. I listened more than I spoke, grateful for the distraction. He asked what brought me north, and I told him a half-truth, that I was seeking employment in a household near the coast. He nodded sympathetically and said that times were hard for young women without family, that the world was not kind to those who must make their own way. He said it without pity, merely as observation, and I appreciated his plainness. When I finally retired to my room, I found I could not sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, the walls thin enough to hear every creak and murmur from neighboring rooms, and my mind would not quiet. I thought of my father, of the life we had shared before illness and poverty destroyed it. I thought of the books I had loved and lost, the dreams I had buried in the same grave as Edmund Thornwood. I thought of Sebastian's face in the firelight, the way he had looked at me as though I mattered. A knock on my door startled me so badly I nearly cried out. I crept to the door on silent feet, my heart pounding, and asked who was there. Sebastian's voice answered, low and urgent, and I opened the door before I could think better of it. He stood in the dim corridor, still dressed, his face taut with something I could not name. He asked if he could come in, and I stepped aside without a word. The room was so small that his presence seemed to fill it entirely, and I was suddenly painfully aware of my state of undress, my hair unbound and my feet bare beneath my borrowed nightgown. He did not look at me the way men typically look at women in such circumstances. There was no hunger in his gaze, no calculation. There was only need, raw and open, the need for connection that had brought him to my door in the middle of the night. He said he could not sleep. He said that every time he closed his eyes, he saw the great hall at Raven's Hollow, saw the king's cold smile, heard the Latin words that should have been his death sentence. He said that he kept expecting to wake and find that our escape had been a dream, that he was still trapped in that hall with no way out. I understood. The same visions haunted me, the same disbelief that we had survived what should have been unsurvivable. I told him to sit, gesturing to the room's single chair, and took my place on the edge of the bed. And then, because there was nothing else to offer, I talked. I told him about the first time I read Virgil in the original, how the words had seemed to sing off the page in a way the translations never captured. I told him about my father's hands, ink-stained and gentle, turning pages with the reverence of a priest handling holy relics. I told him about the day I realized I loved learning more than I would ever love any person, and how that realization had both freed and imprisoned me. I talked until my voice grew hoarse and the candle burned low, and Sebastian listened, as he always listened, with his whole attention, as though my words were precious. When I finally fell silent, he spoke. He told me about Margaret, about the guilt he carried, not for her death, but for the relief he had felt when she was gone. He said that their marriage had been happy at first, genuinely happy, but that something had changed in the final year. Margaret had grown distant, secretive, prone to fits of weeping she would not explain. He had tried to reach her, tried to understand what troubled her, but she had shut him out with a thoroughness that left him bewildered and hurt. When she died, he had mourned her, truly mourned, but beneath the grief had lurked a shameful gratitude that the confusion was finally over. He had never told anyone this. He said the words as though they were being dragged from him, each one costing more than the last. I did not judge. I did not comfort. I simply bore witness, as he had borne witness to my own confessions, and when he finished, the silence between us was not empty, but full. He rose to leave, thanking me for listening, and I should have let him go. I should have maintained the proper distance, preserved what remained of my dignity and his, but I did not. I caught his hand as he passed, and he stopped, and we stood there in the guttering candlelight, connected by touch and silence and something too fragile to name. He asked me what I wanted, not what I expected, not what I thought possible, but what I truly wanted. And I, who had spent 5 years suppressing my wants until they were nothing but ghosts, found that I could not lie to him. I told him I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be known. I wanted to stop pretending that I was less than I was, that my mind and my heart and my dreams did not matter, because I had been born poor and female in a world that valued neither. I told him I wanted to read books again, to have conversations that challenged me, to feel as though my existence served some purpose beyond survival. I told him I wanted, God help me, to be loved by someone who understood what they were loving. He did not kiss me. He did not make promises he could not keep. He simply lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, gentle and reverent, and said that I deserved all of those things and more. Then he left, closing the door softly behind him, and I stood in the darkness with my hand still warm from his touch and wept for reasons I could not fully explain. We reached Whitby on the evening of the 5th day. The town clung to the cliffs like a creature refusing to be swept into the sea, its narrow streets winding steeply toward the ruined abbey that crowned the headland. The harbor was full of fishing boats and merchant vessels, their masts swaying against a sky streaked with the last colors of sunset. Somewhere among those ships was our salvation, the vessel that would carry us away from England and everything we had known. Bartholomew led us to a boarding house near the waterfront, run by a widow named Mrs. Whitmore, who asked no questions and expected no answers. Our rooms were small but clean, and for the first time since Raven's Hollow, I slept in a proper bed with proper sheets and woke without the immediate fear of discovery. We would wait here, Bartholomew explained, until the ship was ready to sail. 2 days, perhaps 3. The captain needed time to secure provisions and a favorable tide. Those days of waiting were a strange interlude, suspended between flight and freedom. Sebastian could not risk being seen in public, so he remained in his room, pacing like a caged animal, while I was sent out to purchase supplies and gather what news I could from the town. It was the first time since our escape that I had been alone in the world, and I found the solitude both liberating and terrifying. Whitby was a town accustomed to secrets. Smugglers had used its hidden coves for generations, and the locals had learned not to notice what they should not see. I moved through the market and the shops with my head down and my ears open, listening for any whisper of pursuit. There were soldiers in town, I learned, but they were searching for Scottish agitators, not fleeing dukes. The king's men had apparently focused their hunt further south, following false trails that Bartholomew's allies had laid. For the moment, we were safe. I brought this news to Sebastian on the second evening, along with fresh bread and cheese and a bottle of wine I had purchased with the last of my coins. He received me in his room with a smile that made my heart stutter, and we sat together by the window, watching the lights of the harbor flicker in the gathering dusk. He asked me what I would do in Amsterdam. I told him I did not know. I told him I supposed I would seek employment, perhaps as a governess or a translator, anything that would use my education rather than waste it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that stopped my breath. He said he did not want me to be a governess. He said he did not want me to disappear into some merchant's household and spend the rest of my life teaching children who would never appreciate what they were learning. He said he wanted me to stay with him, not as a servant, not as an obligation, but as an equal. He said he knew it was madness, knew that society would condemn them both, knew that his family would object and his name would be tarnished beyond repair. But he did not care. He had spent 3 years mourning a wife who had shut him out, and he had no intention of spending the rest of his life shut out from happiness by the arbitrary rules of a society that had tried to kill him. I could not speak. The words I wanted to say tangled in my throat, too large and too numerous to emerge. I stared at him, at this man who had been my master and my companion, and something more I dared not name, and I saw in his eyes the same fear and hope that churned in my own heart. I told him that I did not need his pity. I told him that I would not be taken as a mistress, a convenient woman to warm his bed and bear his shame. I told him that I had dignity, even if the world insisted I did not, and I would not surrender it for comfort or security. He flinched as though I had struck him. And then, slowly, deliberately, he knelt before me. A duke on his knees before a servant girl, in a shabby room in a harbor town, with the sound of the sea filling the silence between us. He took my hands in his and looked up at me with eyes that held no deception, no calculation, only a vulnerability that made him seem younger and more human than I had ever seen him. He said he was not offering me a position. He was offering me his heart, battered and scarred as it was. He said he knew he was not worthy of me, knew that no title or fortune could compensate for the arrogance that had allowed him to see her only as an anomaly, a curiosity, for so many weeks before he recognized her as the remarkable woman she was. He said he was asking, not demanding, hoping, not expecting, and if I refused him, he would accept my refusal and never speak of it again, but he would spend the rest of his life regretting that he had not tried. I pulled my hands from his and stood. I walked to the window and looked out at the harbor, at the ships that rocked gently on the tide, at the darkness that was swallowing the last light of day. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, the face of a woman I barely recognized. She looked stronger than I felt, braver, more certain. I asked him what he imagined our life would be. A duke in exile, stripped of his lands and title, married to a servant girl with nothing but a dead scholar's teachings to recommend her. Where would we live? How would we survive? What would we do when the world discovered that Sebastian Blackwood had thrown away his legacy for a woman so far beneath him that society would not even grant her the dignity of scorn? He rose and came to stand behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, not touching, not presuming, simply present. He said he did not know. He said that for the first time in his life, he was facing a future without a map, without the certainty of inheritance and obligation that had guided his every step since birth. He said it terrified him, but he said that the terror was nothing compared to the emptiness he felt when he imagined that future without me in it. I turned to face him. We stood inches apart, breath mingling, the moment suspended like a held note in a symphony. And I made my choice. I told him yes. The kiss that followed was nothing like the first. It was not born of desperation or relief, but of decision, conscious and deliberate. His arms came around me and mine around him, and we held each other in that shabby room as though the world outside had ceased to exist. For a few precious moments, there was no king hunting us, no society waiting to condemn us, no uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. There was only this, only us. We did not share a bed that night. Sebastian was old-fashioned enough to insist on propriety, even in exile, and I loved him more for it. He left me at my door with a kiss on my forehead and a promise to speak with Bartholomew in the morning about finding a clergyman in Amsterdam who might marry them quietly, without questions. I lay awake for hours afterward, staring at the ceiling, hardly daring to believe that this was real. But reality has a way of intruding on happiness, and ours intruded violently just before dawn. I was woken by shouting, by the sound of boots on stairs, by Bartholomew's voice raised in alarm. I threw on my dress and opened my door to chaos. Soldiers filled the narrow corridor, their red coats bright as blood in the lamplight. Mrs. Whitmore stood pressed against the wall, her face white with terror. And between two of the soldiers, his hands already bound, stood Sebastian. His eyes found mine across the corridor, and in them I saw not fear, but sorrow. Sorrow for what we had almost had. Sorrow for the future that was slipping away, even as we reached for it. One of the soldiers grabbed my arm. He demanded to know who I was, what I was doing here, how I knew the traitor they had finally caught. I opened my mouth to answer, to lie, to say anything that might save us. But before I could speak, Sebastian's voice cut through the noise. He told them I was no one, a maid he had hired in Whitby to attend to his rooms. She knew nothing of his identity or his crimes. She was innocent, and they should release her immediately. The soldier holding me looked skeptical, but an officer appeared and confirmed the order. I was released with a warning not to leave town until I had been questioned properly. And then they dragged Sebastian down the stairs and out into the gray morning. And I stood in that corridor with my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces and no idea how to put them back together. Bartholomew found me still standing there minutes later. His face was grim, but his voice was calm. He told me that all was not lost. He told me that he had contacts in London, men who owed debts to the Blackwood family, men who might be able to intervene before the worst happened. He told me that I must be strong, must be patient, must trust that Sebastian would not be abandoned. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was not the end, that the happiness I had glimpsed for one brief night was not already gone forever. But as I watched the sun rise over Whitby Harbor, watched the soldiers march Sebastian toward a future I could not see and might not survive, I felt hope slipping through my fingers like sand. And I understood, for the first time, the true cost of loving a man the world wanted to destroy. They took him to York, to the castle that had served as both fortress and prison for centuries, and I followed like a ghost, haunting the roads of my own despair. Bartholomew tried to dissuade me, insisted that my presence would only draw attention, that I could do nothing for Sebastian by trailing after the soldiers who held him captive. But I had already lost everything once in my life, had watched helplessly as my father slipped away and my future crumbled to dust, and I would not stand idle while the man I loved was marched toward a trial that could only end in one way. The journey to York took 3 days by the public coach, 3 days of cramped seats and suspicious glances and the constant, gnawing fear that I was already too late. I had no plan, no resources, no connections that might help. I had only my wits and my desperation and the Latin phrases that still echoed in my memory, the words that had started everything. Claudite portus, nemo exeat vivus, lock the doors, let no one leave alive. The king had wanted Sebastian dead, and now he had him in chains. What hope could a servant girl possibly offer against the power of the crown? Bartholomew had pressed coins into my hand before I left Whitby, more money than I had ever held at once, and had given me an address in York where I might find allies. A solicitor, he said, named Mr. Edmund Fairfax, who had handled legal matters for the Blackwood family for decades and might be persuaded to help if properly approached. I clutched that address like a talisman throughout the journey, repeating the name in my mind until it became a prayer. Edmund Fairfax. Edmund, like my father. Surely that was a sign. Surely fate would not be so cruel as to dangle hope before me, only to snatch it away. York was a city of contradictions, ancient walls encircling modern ambitions, churches soaring beside factories, wealth and poverty pressed together so closely they seemed to share the same breath. I found lodgings in a boarding house near the Minster, a respectable establishment that asked no questions of a young woman traveling alone, and spent my first evening simply walking the streets, orienting myself to a city I had never visited and might never leave. The castle loomed on its hill across the river, its gray stones dark against the evening sky, and I stared at it until my eyes burned, wondering which window belonged to the cell where Sebastian lay. Mr. Edmund Fairfax received me the following morning with the courteous skepticism of a man accustomed to desperate visitors. His offices occupied the upper floor of a building near the courts, cramped rooms overflowing with papers and legal volumes that reminded me painfully of my father's cottage. He was elderly, stooped, with spectacles perched on a nose that had clearly been broken at least once, and he listened to my story with an expression that revealed nothing. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he asked a question I had not expected. He asked how I had understood the king's Latin when no one else in the hall had recognized it. I told him the truth about my father, about my education, about the years of hiding my knowledge behind a servant's mask. He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had suspected, and then he told me something that changed everything. The king's case against Sebastian Blackwood was built on forged documents, letters supposedly written by the Duke, pledging allegiance to foreign powers and promising military secrets in exchange for gold. The letters had appeared 3 months before the king's visit to Raven's Hollow, conveniently discovered by a servant who had since disappeared. The king's advisors had declared them authentic, and Sebastian had been condemned without trial, without opportunity to defend himself, on the basis of evidence he had never seen. But Mr. Fairfax had seen the letters. He had obtained copies through channels he declined to explain, and he had recognized immediately that they were forgeries. The handwriting was close but not exact. The seal had been clumsily reproduced. And most damningly, the letters contained references to events that had not yet occurred when they were supposedly written. Whoever had forged them had been careless, confident that no one would examine them closely once the king had pronounced judgment. I asked why this evidence had not been presented, why Sebastian still languished in prison if proof of his innocence existed. Mr. Fairfax's face darkened. He said that the courts were controlled by the king's men, that judges who valued their positions knew better than to contradict the crown's verdicts, that presenting evidence of forgery would be tantamount to accusing the king himself of conspiracy. Sebastian's only hope was an appeal directly to Parliament, where factions hostile to the current regime might seize the opportunity to embarrass the monarch. But such appeals took time, months at minimum, and Mr. Fairfax did not know if Sebastian had months remaining. I left his office with my mind racing and my heart heavier than when I had arrived. Parliament, politics, the machinations of powerful men playing games with other men's lives. I understood none of it, had spent my years in service deliberately avoiding the newspapers and pamphlets that might have educated me, caring only for survival and the books that offered escape from my circumstances. Now I wished I had paid more attention. Now I wished I knew the names and alliances that might be leveraged to save the man I loved. The days that followed were a blur of activity and frustration. Mr. Fairfax introduced me to others who supported the Duke's cause. Minor nobles and wealthy merchants who had benefited from the Blackwood family's patronage and now wished to repay those debts. They met in private rooms, spoke in low voices, passed documents wrapped in plain paper. I was included in these meetings because I could read the Latin correspondence that sometimes arrived from sympathizers abroad, and because no one suspected a servant girl of being a spy. My invisibility, which had once felt like a curse, became my greatest asset. I learned the outlines of the conspiracy against Sebastian. His father had made enemies at court, powerful men who had never forgiven slights, both real and imagined. When the old Duke died, those enemies had turned their attention to the son, waiting for an opportunity to destroy him. The king himself was not the architect of the plot, but rather its willing instrument, easily convinced that Sebastian Blackwood harbored treasonous intentions by advisers who had their own reasons for wanting the Duke eliminated. Chief among these advisers was Lord Ashworth, the brother of Sebastian's late wife Margaret, a man whose ambitions had been thwarted by the marriage and whose hatred had only grown after her death. I remembered Margaret now with new eyes. Sebastian had told me that she had grown distant and secretive in the final year of her life. Had she discovered her brother's plotting? Had she tried to warn her husband and been silenced before she could? The questions multiplied in my mind, but I had no way to answer them and no time to pursue the mystery. Sebastian was running out of time, and every day I spent unraveling the past was a day closer to his execution. 3 weeks after my arrival in York, I received permission to visit the castle. Mr. Fairfax had arranged it through a sympathetic guard, and I was warned that I would have only minutes, that I must say nothing that could be overheard and reported. I prepared myself as best I could, washing my face and braiding my hair, wearing the simple gray dress that was the most respectable garment I owned. And then I walked across the bridge and through the gates and up the winding stairs to the cell where Sebastian Blackwood waited for death. He looked older than I remembered, though only a month had passed since Whitby. There were shadows beneath his eyes and new lines carved around his mouth. His fine clothes had been replaced by rough prison garments, and his hands, when he reached through the bars to take mine, were rough with calluses from the hard labor they forced upon even noble prisoners. But his eyes were the same. His eyes still held that mixture of sorrow and strength that had first drawn me to him, and when he saw me standing in the corridor, those eyes filled with something that might have been tears. He asked me what I was doing here. He asked if I had lost my mind, if I understood the danger of associating with a condemned traitor. He asked why I had not taken the money and fled to Amsterdam as he had ordered Bartholomew to ensure. His voice was harsh, angry, but beneath the anger I heard fear, not fear for himself, but fear for me. Even now, even facing execution, his first thought was for my safety. I told him I loved him. I told him I had not fled, because fleeing would have meant abandoning the only person who had ever seen me as I truly was. I told him about Mr. Fairfax and the forged letters and the allies working to save him. I told him to hold on, to not surrender to despair, because I had not saved his life in Ravenshollow, only to lose him now. He pressed his forehead against the bars, and I pressed mine against his, and we stood there for a long moment, breathing each other's air, connected by iron and love and the impossibility of our circumstances. He told me that I was the bravest person he had ever known. He told me that if he died tomorrow, he would die grateful for the time we had shared, for the conversations and the kiss and the single night when we had spoken of a future together. He told me that he loved me, that he had loved me since the moment I whispered a warning in his ear and threw away my life to save his. The guard cleared his throat. Our time was ending. I pulled back from the bars and looked at Sebastian one last time, memorizing his face, storing every detail in my heart against the darkness ahead. I promised him I would not stop fighting. I promised him I would find a way. And then I turned and walked down the stairs and out of the castle, my composure held together by nothing but will, until I reached the privacy of my boarding house room and shattered completely. The breakthrough came a week later, from a source none of us had expected. A letter arrived for Mr. Fairfax, delivered by private messenger and sealed with a crest I did not recognize. He read it in silence, his expression shifting from suspicion to astonishment to something approaching hope. When he finished, he looked at me with new eyes. The letter was from the Dowager Countess of Ashworth, Margaret's mother, Lord Ashworth's mother, a woman who had reason to support the conspiracy against Sebastian and no reason at all to help him. Yet here she was, offering evidence that would destroy her own son. She had discovered, the letter explained, documents proving that Lord Ashworth had forged the treasonous letters. She had found them hidden in his study after he departed for London, and though the discovery had broken her heart, she could not allow an innocent man to die for her son's ambition. She was old, she wrote, and had not many years remaining. She would not face her God with the blood of Sebastian Blackwood on her conscience. There was more. She revealed that Margaret had indeed discovered the plot and had confronted her brother before her death. Lord Ashworth had sworn to abandon his schemes, had promised his sister that Sebastian would not be harmed, but he had lied. And the stress of knowing, of carrying a secret she dared not share with her husband for fear of starting a war between their families, had contributed to the complications that took her life in childbirth. The Dowager Countess had pieced this together from Margaret's diaries, which she had found hidden in a chest of keepsakes after her daughter's death. I wept when Mr. Fairfax told me. I wept for Margaret, who had loved her husband enough to try to protect him and had died carrying a burden that should never have been hers alone. I wept for Sebastian, who had blamed himself for his wife's distance without knowing the true cause. I wept for the senseless waste of it all, the lives destroyed by one man's hatred and ambition. But there was no time for grief. The Dowager Countess had included with her letter copies of the documents she had found, enough to prove the forgery beyond any reasonable doubt. Mr. Fairfax began immediately to prepare a petition to Parliament, working through the nights to compile evidence and arguments that would free Sebastian from his death sentence. The sympathizers we had gathered doubled their efforts, writing letters, calling in favors, building the coalition that might finally bring justice. I did what I could to help, copying documents and carrying messages and sitting through meetings where men debated strategy in terms I barely understood. I was still invisible to most of them, still just the servant girl who happened to read Latin, but I no longer cared about recognition. I cared only about the outcome. I cared only about Sebastian. A month passed, then another. Winter descended on York with bitter cold and early darkness, and still we waited for Parliament to act. Sebastian remained in his cell, and I visited when I could, bringing him books that the sympathetic guard allowed and news of our progress. He grew thinner, paler, but his spirit did not break. He told me that my visits were the only thing keeping him sane, that hearing my voice through the bars was like hearing music after years of silence. I told him to hold on. I told him it would not be much longer. I prayed that I was not lying. The summons came in February, on a day when snow covered the streets of York and ice hung from the eaves like crystal tears. Parliament had agreed to hear the petition. Sebastian would be transported to London to stand before the Lords and present his defense. It was not acquittal, not yet, but it was hope. It was the chance we had been fighting for. I was not permitted to accompany him. A woman of my station had no place in the halls of Parliament, no right to witness the proceedings that would determine whether the man I loved lived or died. I watched from the street as the carriage departed, flanked by guards, Sebastian's face a pale blur in the window. He found me in the crowd and pressed his palm against the glass, and I pressed mine against the empty air, and then the carriage rounded the corner, and he was gone. The weeks of waiting that followed were the longest of my life. I could not eat, could not sleep, could barely breathe without choking on the fear that consumed me. Mr. Fairfax had gone to London to oversee the legal proceedings, and I received letters from him detailing the arguments and counter-arguments, the testimonies and objections, the endless procedural battles that seemed designed to prevent justice rather than ensure it. Lord Ashworth had powerful allies, he wrote. The king himself had spoken against Sebastian in private audiences. Nothing was certain. And then, on the first day of March, a messenger arrived at my boarding house with a letter sealed in black wax. My hands shook so badly I could barely break the seal. I unfolded the paper and read the words that would either restore my life or end it. The verdict was in. Parliament had ruled, and Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, had been declared innocent of all charges of treason. I dropped to my knees on the cold floor of my room and wept until I had no tears left. He was free. He was alive. The nightmare was finally, impossibly over. But as I read further, I discovered that freedom had come at a cost. Lord Ashworth, facing arrest for his crimes, had fled England for the Continent. The king, humiliated by the exposure of the plot, had retreated into sullen silence, nursing grievances that would no doubt surface again in years to come. And Sebastian, though exonerated, had lost nearly everything. Ravenshollow had been seized by the crown during his imprisonment and would not be returned. His fortune had been depleted by legal fees and bribes. He was a duke in name only, with no estate, no income, and no prospects. Mr. Fairfax's letter ended with a question. Sebastian wished to know if I would still have him, now that he had nothing to offer but his name and his heart. He wished to know if the future we had spoken of in Whitby was still possible, or if the realities of his diminished circumstances had changed my feelings. I laughed aloud at the absurdity of the question, as if I had ever wanted his title or his fortune, as if any of that mattered compared to the man himself. I wrote my answer that same night and sent it by the fastest messenger I could afford. And then I packed my meager belongings and began the journey to London, to Sebastian, to whatever life awaited us in this new world where nothing was certain except love. I found him standing in a churchyard in Cheapside, beneath a sky the color of old pewter, and for a moment I simply watched him from the gate, afraid that if I moved too quickly he might dissolve like mist in morning sun. He was thinner than I remembered, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once filled them with aristocratic ease, and there was gray in his hair that had not been there 6 months ago. But he was alive. He was free. And when he turned and saw me standing there, his face transformed in a way that made every mile of my journey, every sleepless night, every moment of terror and despair, worth enduring. He crossed the churchyard in 3 strides and gathered me into his arms with a ferocity that stole my breath. I buried my face against his chest and inhaled the scent of him, wool and soap and something indefinably his, and I felt the last of the walls I had built around my heart crumble into dust. We stood there for what might have been minutes or hours, holding each other in the shadow of a church neither of us had ever entered, while London moved around us with its noise and bustle and utter indifference to the miracle taking place in its midst. When we finally pulled apart, Sebastian cupped my face in his hands and looked at me as though memorizing every feature. He told me I was more beautiful than he remembered. He told me that my letters had been the only light in the darkness of his cell, that he had read them so many times the paper had worn thin at the creases. He told me that he had been afraid, in those final weeks, that I would come to my senses and realize that a ruined duke was no prize worth claiming. I told him he was a fool. The word came out fiercer than I intended, rough with emotion, and he laughed. That same rusty, startled laugh I had heard in the hunting lodge a lifetime ago. I told him that I had not fallen in love with a title or an estate or the promise of fine gowns and gilded carriages. I had fallen in love with a man who read Seneca aloud in an empty study, who looked at a servant girl and saw a scholar, who had knelt before me in a shabby room and offered his heart with no expectation that I would accept it. That man was still standing before me, and I would not let him go. He kissed me then, there in the churchyard, with pigeons cooing on the rooftops and a flower seller calling her wares on the street beyond. It was not a proper kiss, not the sort of kiss a lady should accept from a gentleman in public view. But I was not a lady, and propriety had long since ceased to govern my choices. I kissed him back with all the longing of the months we had been separated, and when we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, I saw tears on his cheeks that matched the ones on mine. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of joy and uncertainty. Sebastian had taken lodgings in a modest house near Lincoln's Inn, 2 small rooms that would have fit inside the entrance hall of Ravenshollow, with space to spare. He had dismissed his remaining servants, unable to pay their wages, and was learning to fend for himself with the awkwardness of a man who had never before needed to boil water or sweep a floor. I moved into a neighboring boarding house, close enough to see him daily, but distant enough to preserve what remained of my reputation, though I cared little for reputation now. Mr. Fairfax had managed to salvage some portion of Sebastian's fortune, funds that had been held in trust and could not be seized by the crown. It was enough to live on, modestly, if we were careful. Enough to rent a small house and perhaps hire a single servant. Enough to survive, though not to flourish. Sebastian spoke of finding employment, perhaps as a translator or a tutor, positions that would have been unthinkable for a duke, but were perfectly respectable for a gentleman of reduced circumstances. I told him I would work as well, that 2 incomes would stretch further than one, that I had not spent 5 years in service only to become a burden now. We argued about it, gently, in the way of people who are learning to build a life together from mismatched pieces. He wanted to protect me, to spare me the indignity of labor after everything I had endured. I wanted to contribute, to be his partner in truth, and not merely his dependent. We compromised, as we would learn to compromise on many things, and agreed that I would seek a position as a governess or companion only if our finances required it. The wedding was held in April, in the same Cheapside church where we had reunited 2 months earlier. Mr. Fairfax served as witness, along with Mrs. Whitmore from the boarding house in Whitby, who had traveled to London for the occasion and wept throughout the ceremony. There were no other guests. Sebastian's brothers were too far away to attend, and the society that had once welcomed him would never acknowledge a marriage so far beneath his station. I wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, the finest garment I had ever owned, purchased with coins I had saved from my years in service. Sebastian wore a dark coat that had seen better days, but his eyes shone as he spoke his vows, and his voice did not waver. When the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, I became Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenshollow, a title so absurd in my circumstances that I nearly laughed aloud. A duchess who had scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots. A duchess who could parse Cicero but had never learned to dance. A duchess whose wedding breakfast consisted of bread and cheese and a bottle of wine shared in 2 small rooms with peeling wallpaper and a view of an alley. It was ridiculous. It was wonderful. It was the happiest day of my life. The first year of our marriage was one of adjustment and discovery. We rented a cottage in Hampstead, far enough from London to be affordable, but close enough for Sebastian to seek employment. He found work as a translator for a publishing house, rendering French and German texts into English for a wage that would have been an insult to the Duke of Ravenshollow, but was a lifeline to Sebastian Blackwood, gentlemen. I kept our small household running, cooking and cleaning and managing our meager budget with the skills I had learned in service. It was hard work, harder in some ways than my years as a maid, because now the work was for us, for our survival, and the stakes felt impossibly high. But there was joy too, joy that I had never imagined possible. Evenings spent reading aloud to each other by candlelight, taking turns with the voices, laughing at our own dramatic interpretations. Mornings waking in Sebastian's arms, warm and safe and loved. Conversations that wandered from philosophy to gossip to dreams of the future, the kind of conversations I had not had since my father died. We were poor and obscure and utterly insignificant to the world beyond our cottage walls, and we were happy. In the autumn of our first year, I discovered I was with child. The news came as a shock, though it should not have, and I spent a full day in terrified silence before I found the courage to tell Sebastian. I remembered Margaret, remembered how she had died in childbirth, remembered the son who had never drawn breath. I was afraid that Sebastian would remember too, that the news would reopen wounds I had watched him slowly heal. But when I told him, his face did not darken with grief. It lit with a joy so pure and unguarded that I forgot my fear entirely. He lifted me off my feet and spun me around the tiny parlor, laughing like a man half his age. And when he set me down, he knelt before me as he had knelt in Whitby and pressed his lips to my still flat belly and whispered promises to the child within. He promised to love and protect and cherish. He promised to be present, to be worthy, to be everything his own father had been and more. He promised, and I believed him. The pregnancy was difficult. I was ill for months, unable to keep food down, weak and exhausted in ways I had never experienced. Sebastian cared for me with a tenderness that broke my heart daily, rising before dawn to fetch water and bread, sitting by my bedside reading aloud when I was too tired to hold a book myself. He hired a woman from the village to help with the household, spending money we could not afford because he could not bear to see me struggle. I protested, weakly, but secretly I was grateful. I was grateful for everything he did, everything he was, everything he had become since the night I whispered a warning in his ear. Our daughter was born on a spring morning, with apple blossoms drifting past the window and birdsong filling the air. The birth was long and painful, and there were moments when I feared I would not survive it, moments when I understood with terrible clarity how Margaret must have felt in those final hours. But I did survive. And when the midwife placed the squalling, red-faced infant in my arms, when I looked down at the tiny creature Sebastian and I had created together, I understood for the first time what it meant to love without limit or condition. We named her Eleanor, after no one in particular, simply because we liked the sound of it. Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of a duke and a servant, heir to nothing but love and the stubborn hope that the world might someday be kinder than it had been to her parents. She had Sebastian's gray eyes and my dark hair and a temperament that alternated between serene contentment and furious demand with no warning whatsoever. She was perfect. She was ours. The years that followed were not easy. We struggled with money, with health, with the 1,000 small crises that plague every family, regardless of station. Sebastian's work was unpredictable, feast or famine depending on the whims of publishers and the availability of texts to translate. I took in sewing when times were lean, mending garments for neighbors who did not know they were paying a duchess to repair their petticoats. We moved 3 times, each house smaller and cheaper than the last, until we finally settled in a cottage in Surrey that was barely larger than the rooms I had occupied as a servant at Ravenshollow. But we endured. We more than endured. We built a life together, brick by brick, compromise by compromise, argument by argument, reconciliation by reconciliation. Sebastian taught Eleanor to read Latin before she turned 5. carrying on the tradition his family had maintained for generations. I taught her to cook and clean and balance a household budget, skills that would serve her regardless of what fortune brought. We raised her to value knowledge over status, kindness over wealth, love over propriety. We raised her to be the woman we wished the world would let women be. News reached us occasionally from the wider world. Lord Ashworth died in exile in Vienna, alone and unmourned, his ambitions turned to ash. The king's health declined, and with it his interest in pursuing old grievances. Sebastian's brothers wrote from their distant postings, Edward now an admiral in the Caribbean, Thomas now an abbot in his Italian monastery. They sent money when they could, small sums that arrived like gifts from heaven and were spent carefully on necessities we could not otherwise afford. They sent love, which cost nothing and meant everything. When Eleanor was 7, a letter arrived that changed our circumstances entirely. The king had died, and his successor, eager to distance himself from the excesses of the previous reign, had ordered a review of all seizures conducted under suspicion of treason. Ravenshollow was to be returned to its rightful owner. Sebastian Blackwood was once again, in truth as well as name, the Duke of Ravenshollow. I remember the day we returned to the estate. It was autumn again, the moors painted in shades of rust and gold, and the grey stone towers rose against the sky exactly as I remembered from my first arrival as a servant. But everything else had changed. I was no longer the invisible girl who scrubbed pots in the kitchen. I was the Duchess, walking through the front entrance on the arm of my husband, our daughter skipping ahead of us with the careless joy of a child who does not yet understand the weight of history. The servants lined the entrance hall to greet us, new faces mostly, hired by the steward who had maintained the house during its years of crown possession. I looked at them, at their downcast eyes and deferential postures, and I saw myself as I had once been. I made a silent vow that day. I would never forget where I had come from. I would never treat these men and women as less than human, as invisible, as merely useful hands. I would remember, and I would ensure that our household was different. The years at Ravenshollow were the fullest of my life. Sebastian recovered his health and his spirits, throwing himself into the management of the estate with an energy I had not seen since before his imprisonment. I took up the duties of a duchess, overseeing the household, hosting the occasional visitor, navigating the treacherous waters of society with the help of Mrs. Brennan, who had survived her imprisonment and returned to serve us with a loyalty that brought tears to my eyes. Eleanor grew into a young woman of remarkable intelligence and compassion, fluent in 4 languages and utterly unimpressed by the title she would never inherit. There were more children after Eleanor. A son, Edmund, named for my father, who had Sebastian's quiet intensity and my love of books. A daughter, Margaret, named for the woman whose secret had nearly destroyed us all, who had her aunt's gentle spirit and a determination that surprised us all. The nursery that had stood empty since the first Margaret's death was filled with laughter and chaos and the particular brand of joy that only children can create. I am writing this now in the library at Ravenshollow, the same library where I first heard Sebastian reading Seneca aloud, the same library where our story truly began. I am 53 years old, my dark hair streaked with silver, my hands worn from decades of work and love. Sebastian sits across from me, reading a letter from Edmund, who has taken a position at Cambridge, the university that would never have admitted his mother, but has welcomed his son with open arms. Eleanor is visiting with her own children, 2 girls who have their grandmother's eyes and their grandfather's laugh. Margaret is in London, pursuing studies in medicine that would have been impossible a generation ago, but are merely unusual now. I have lived a life I never imagined possible. I have loved and been loved, struggled and triumphed, lost everything and found it again in forms I never expected. I have been a scholar's daughter and a servant and a fugitive and a duchess, and all of these identities live within me still, layered like the pages of a book that tells a story only I can fully read. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and Sebastian sleeps beside me with his hand resting on my hip as it has for 30 years. I think about the girl who stood in the great hall at Ravenshollow and heard a king order a murder in Latin. I think about the choice she made in that moment, the choice that set everything else in motion. She could not have known what would follow. She could not have imagined the pain and the joy, the loss and the love, the long and winding path that would lead her here, to this library, to this life, to this man who saw her when she was invisible and loved her when she had nothing to offer but herself. I think about her, that frightened girl with her secret education and her hidden dreams, and I want to tell her that it will be worth it. Every moment of terror, every night of despair, every time she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, it will all be worth it in the end. Because love, I have learned, is not a single grand gesture. It is not a rescue or a proposal or a wedding in a cheapside church. Love is the accumulation of 1,000 small choices made day after day, year after year, in the face of uncertainty and hardship and all the forces that conspire to tear us apart. Love is Sebastian bringing me tea when I am tired. Love is arguing about money and finding our way back to each other before the sun sets. Love is watching our children grow and knowing that we created something that will outlast us both. I set down my pen and look across the library at my husband, at the man who was once a cold and grieving duke and is now simply Sebastian, the other half of my heart. He feels my gaze and looks up from his letter, and his face softens into the smile he reserves only for me, the smile that still makes my breath catch after all these years. He asks what I am writing. I tell him I am writing our story. He asks if it has a happy ending, and I look around the library, at the books that have been my companions since childhood, at the fire crackling in the hearth, at the sounds of our grandchildren playing somewhere in the distance. I tell him yes. It has the happiest ending I could have imagined. And it is still being written, day by day, choice by choice, love by love, until the very last page.